thank you again for joining us for today's conversation on women's rights in Tunisia. My name is Intisar Fakir. I'm a senior fellow and the director of the North Africa Sahel program at the Middle East Institute. It's my pleasure to host our last discussion in this series of events that we've held throughout 2022, focused specifically on Tunisia in collaboration with the North Africa Policy Institute. Our collaboration so far has included two series, one that we did on Libya in 2021 and the Tunisia series, which we are concluding today. So thank you again for joining us. I want to get to the issue of today's conversation, and maybe I want to start a little bit with the good story, right? So Tunisia has made progress in improving women's participation in politics through a system of parity and in enshrining protection for women in its legal system. This has been a good headline that we have seen really since the revolution in 2021. However, these gains have been fragile and they have been difficult to sustain. The economic and political reality is that women are still nowhere near on par with their male counterparts in terms of economic well-being, in terms of physical well-being, as women continue to suffer physical and sexual violence. And of course, nowhere near equal representation in the workplace, in politics, in leadership, and really the list goes on. Many of these indicators, of course, have worsened with the global pandemic, which put a huge burden on women, really a disproportionate burden on women. And of course, all of this situation that we are describing really is an immense global problem. But what we want to do today is really to try and understand how it plays out in Tunisia and sort of the specificity of the issue within a Tunisian context. So we have three speakers joining us today. Two of them are on the screen. One will be joining us later. And I will start with introducing the two that are with us. Fadwa Al-Ouni has a background in law and experience in elections with expertise in election observation and advocacy. She has delivered extensive training sessions on the electoral legal framework, as well as analysis, analytical papers, and general advice on electoral law-related matters. Previously, she worked for Democracy Reporting International and the National Elections Commission. She is currently with the Carter Center. And a disclaimer about Fadwa's intervention is these represent her views, not the Carter Center's views. The second speaker on the screen with us today is Fadwa Bouguerra. She specializes in the development of and implementation of both gender equity and equality to provide sustainable social, political, and economic development in the MENA region. In her capacity as a gender specialist, she works on several projects partnered with GIZ, IFES, Mythos, HIVOS, and CAS, and other national and international assistance programs to empower women and reinforce their integration and contribution into decision making. She closely worked on young female participation in politics and women's contributions to economic growth. Ms. Bouguerra has conducted field research on gender-based violence and its impact on female representation in society, politics, and economy. Her research and academic endeavors focus on gender-based violence in both private and public sectors. And then last but not least is Kenza Bouazouz, who we hope will be joining us soon. She is a feminist researcher trained in anthropology. She has worked with various humanitarian and human rights organizations, including OHCHR, Mercy Corps, Human Rights Watch, the OECD, Tufts University. She has worked on issues of violence and discrimination against women, racism, migration, and human trafficking across the Mediterranean, West Africa, and the Levant. She is interested in applying intersectional feminist analysis to development issues, critical race theory, and decolonization approaches. And Kenza, you joined right at the right moment, just as I was introducing you. So welcome to this webinar. Very glad to have you with us. So with those introductions, I want to kick off the discussion with you, Kenza, since you just joined. I want to start with you and maybe have you give us a sense of, how do you characterize the process by which Tunisia, has attempted to try to improve women's participation and try to achieve some equity really over the past 10 years since the 2011 revolution. So I will start with you, Kenza, and then we'll move on to other participants. Just very quickly, before I give you the floor, the idea is that we will do a couple of rounds of questions amongst ourselves, and then we will open the discussion to our participants. So if you are with us, please be sure to use the Q&A function to propose your questions. The chat function is disabled, so please go ahead and submit your questions through the Q&A function. And then Kenza, we will go ahead and start with you.
Thank you, and sorry for the slight delay. I was following, but not as a speaker. And thank you for having me, and thank you for the introduction. So in terms of your question, I think it really depends, again, on which aspect of Tunisia we're talking. I think we've gone into very different directions, sometimes simultaneously. I think it also depends on which phase. So if I understand why we're situating this after the revolution, and we've definitely seen an adoption, especially under Beji Sibsi, of very strong laws in 2018. So I'm talking in particular about a law that I've researched thoroughly in the past 16 months, on the Law 58 on the elimination of violence against women, which is one of the strongest in the Middle East and North Africa, and even beyond, like in Africa, it's one of the strongest. It does encompass political, economic, physical, psychological, and sexual forms of violence. And it offers tremendous levels of protection to women. Again, then some of the issues that we see are in terms of implementation, and also beyond capacity and the means that have been attributed to it, we have issues in terms of real absorption by the decision makers and the institutions that are supposed to carry this law forth. And this would apply to other strong laws that we've seen to protect women, such as one on, this one is more broadly, but then happens to cover a lot of women who are in very vulnerable positions, such as domestic workers. And so far, just as goes for the anti-racial discrimination laws, we've seen very little change in practice. So for sure, these are gains, and they do hold symbolic values, and especially they've enabled us to have very constructive and unprecedented levels of debate, notably around inheritance. And I think this opened a very sensitive question and broad discussions that were unhoped for. So this is a significant advance, but we are still seeing that there have been no efforts to renew the personal status code with regards to equality in inheritance. The debate has been really cut short, and whether it comes to women's right to abortion, for example, who have been granted by the personal status code, we know that in practice, women are still very much scared of stigmatization or issues that they could face within the health, from the health personnel as well. And around them especially, this is, I think the key issue is that we might have made significant progress in terms of legislations, but women in their individual day-to-day life, in their bodies, don't yet feel very secure. And I think many women, it is very often cited that Tunisian women have had the right to divorce very early, but yet women are very scared of stigmatization and what that would mean, not only financially for them, but also socially.
Yeah, thanks, Kenza. You bring up a lot of really excellent points about sort of the legal system and the laws in many ways, just sort of pioneering laws for the region. But then you kind of have the implementation side of it, which remains lagging. And Fadwa Bogara, I want to come to you and have you maybe give us a broader sense about how things are playing out in terms of these laws that we have that are great. And there's even some very promising discussion, for example, on the inheritance law, on potentially the abortion debate as well. But again, the lack of implementation. Where does that leave women, and what more needs to be done in that space?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all, and thank you for the speakers who are joining us and the participants as well. And what Kinza just came to say is very promising practically, that when it comes to implementation and applying the laws, it's still lagging behind, or Tunisia is still lagging behind. And I will get back to Tunisia's Law 58 for the elimination of violence against women that has been provided and performed by the Beji Qais in 2017, for instance, which was hailed as a landmark step in combating violence against women. However, it still works on refining and redefining, let's say, new criminal offenses while considering troubling loophole in the penal code. We cannot really deny the fact that the Person Status Code of 1956 was definitely what claimed Tunisia to be a feminist state, but still we're trying to cope with these loopholes in order to decipher what could be done and what could be, let's say, immersed or installed in making this implementation way better. So when it comes to for instance, this Law 52, and talking about, for instance, the Article 218 that only included the physical violence rather than the psychological and economic one, which was proposed by Law 52, for instance. It definitely talked about the marital rape that fell under board language of the Article 227 of Penal Code, that no law actually or specifically criminalized spousal rape or intimate partner violence, which, let's say, leads us to questioning what are we doing as a feminist state, or what are we doing in terms of empowering women and advocating for women's rights as Tunisian people and population. There is another loophole talking about the implementation that allows rapists to escape punishment if they ever get married to their victims. And this is a very well-known article, and there have been actually protests about it, and having a slogan saying, "How I Met Your Mother, I raped her when she was 13." And that recalls back the incident in the governance of El Kaf. So definitely when we talk about, certain regulations that we are still, let's say, encountering, we definitely need to criminalize them, but we surely have to work upon them and reflect upon them so that we can make them more applicable to our daily life. So I want as well to emphasize that the law criminalized sexual harassment, Law 58, in public spaces and employment as well of children and as domestic workers, and even talked about, let's say, imposing fines on employers when intentionally discriminate against women in pay. So these are attributes, let's say, or these are major triumphs that Tunisia has made so far after the revolution and after 2017, but we are still lagging behind when it comes, for instance, to the law of inheritance that I want to briefly talk about, as you mentioned. So briefly, Beji Qais formed a committee that is entitled COLIBI, that stands for the Individual Freedoms and Equality Committee, to advise on the reform of domestic laws to conform to the post-2014 constitution. And he expressed himself and his cabinet to implement equality in inheritance. However, so much rejection of almost 63% of rejection on the proposal itself against what was tried, let's say, to be implemented as part of our institution in terms of equality and inheritance. Although this law, when they wanted, let's say, to pass the law, they were so obvious about, the the equal compromise, so the consensual compromise, that there will be an equal inheritance that would become the norm. However, Tunisians, they always have the possibility to choose if they wanted to follow the Islamic law-inspired inheritance provision. So till now, I do always say that we are standing on the threshold of having certain laws, but the fact of implementing them is still a little bit tricky and challenging.
Just a quick follow-up for you, Fadwa and Kenza, on the question of inheritance law. This would be really huge in the Arab world and the Muslim world if this were to be put forward. And I want to get a sense from both of you. Kenza, you said the debate on this law was cut short. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the opposition and what's driving that opposition? I'll come to you, Kenza, and then I also want to hear your thoughts on this, Fadwa Bukara.
In terms of the opposition, I think I would like to point to a study that's been released, I think, a couple of months ago. It's called Images, and it's part of a UN initiative. It dug out some quite interesting figures. So, for example, I think 40% of women who had been interviewed, and we're talking about a 2,000 household scale, so it's quite significant still, and in various regions of Tunisia, found that about 40% of women were actually in favor of obtaining equal inheritance. So this, to me, really reshaped my thinking around it, because my initial reaction or thinking around it was that it was still too early, and that it was such an intimate topic and too rooted into families to change as of yet. But now I wonder how much of that is actually a form of utilizing silence and taboo and secrecy that is shrouding women's social and economic rights in general. Because I just wanted to add on to something that I forgot to say earlier. It's not only a matter of implementation, it's also the matter of women's awareness of their rights. And I'm not going to, the burden should definitely not be on women to just know whatever new decree is circulated suddenly, or even their rights constitutionally that we're still yet to fully understand in the current interpretation that they're given. However, women are not informed of their rights when they present themselves to the police to file a complaint against a domestic abuser, for example. They don't know that they can ask protection orders. They don't know that legally they should be entitled to see a psychologist or have a social worker assist them and help them through the process. So there's also this significant gap, not only in terms of the action of those that are supposed to implement it, but also in terms of awareness and willingness to spread this information. And not only due to a certain closure, but also the level of how overwhelmed certain actors are, whether it's in the medical or even within the police themselves. So I just wanted to give a bit of nuance here in terms of the gaps. And so in terms of inheritance, I think this is only anecdotal information, which is also some of the issue. We don't have the knowledge and the tools in order to re-strategize on how to approach this. But there's also been another small-scale study that FTDO has helped implement, and it was with 15 women in different regions of Tunisia, mainly women who work in the agricultural sector. And it is surprising to see how much resentment actually they still hold against their families, against societies for letting this violence happen to them, because it's not only that they don't inherit equally, they don't inherit at all very often, or whatever they inherit is of much lesser value than what their brothers would. And again, this is really an issue that comes down to the social fabric of Tunisia, because it's not only women who are losing here, it's just a matter of social equality and the ability for class to be reconfigured also in many ways. And also I think that there's a lack of awareness, not only among the population, but also as scholars who don't necessarily look perhaps sufficiently into other regions of the world. So I think in Mali, or even in certain Eastern European countries, which are Muslim and who have also adopted equal inheritance laws. So I think we need to also, as scholars and advocates, look more into what has been done and how we can approach this, and present useful arguments into why this would not be anti-Muslim to make this change, because I think it's a very easily and dangerously dissuasive argument that can be put into shaming women for wanting to disrupt norms in this way. And I also want to add, in terms of the silence that it takes to have a legislation that is associated to religion, or the same way that Qais Said has positioned himself in 2020 on the day of Women's National Day, when he said clearly that he would oppose this law and that this was the Quran's word. So it's very much taking a prophetic voice and telling women what they can and cannot ask for. And I think this playing on shame has repercussions in on many levels, and it's something that we see play out constantly. I've had at least 5 out of 30 women, I think this was the figure, telling me that they thought that they owed sex to their husbands. And so if their husband was beating them, or if they thought that he was cheating on them, they wouldn't be scared of filing a complaint because they thought that they were in the wrong. Sorry. So I think it's still very much an obscure topic, and I really think that we should not, like the Colib has done tremendous work arguing that we should, that Tunisia should, so I'm having a little laptop issue. Oh, yes, that Tunisia could go for its equal inheritance law. So I think we need to pick up where we left things, and but a lot has already been done.
Great. Fidwa?
Yeah, I'll just briefly continue from which Kinza just finished. So basically, there is no wonder that what comes to my mind as opposing is the Nahda party, for instance, that vehemently rejected the proposal back in 2018. Back in 2019. And surprisingly, when I talk about women's inheritance and the restriction on that, like of home or land or wealth, that restrain their ability actually to shield themselves from violence, obviously, according to human rights, for instance, here on these restrictions, they say that women are unable or disabled actually to protect themselves from male counterparts, especially where government support services are lacking. And here this leads me to thinking about rural women, for instance, and the way they have to struggle and to suffer from their, let's say, from patriarchal society or from male dominance in terms of economic dependency. Because inheritance issue is not about a Quran or a religious background. We are definitely, respecting the religious background, and that's why I already mentioned that the fact of talking about the passing the law of inheritance has nothing to do or to object with the Quran, but rather talking about what the society and the population needs, as a matter of fact. So basically, when we think about the inheritance, people should start, thinking about this, what we call a resistant change. I think they fear the change of believing that women will be more independent rather than dependent on their male counterparts. And this actually and probably increases the percentage of dependency, and at the same time increases the percentage of violence against women, because if we are always, relying on our male counterparts means that there is no way out. And according to the law 58 for the elimination of violence against women, which provides actually no more than a 2,000 fine of Tunisian dinars, which equals $635 for men who deprive women of economic resources, for instance. I give you a chance to think about it. That's nothing when compared to the actual inheritance, amount of inheritance, let's say. Another thing, already Kinza mentioned that how our president at the moment, Qais Said, I was about to say Beji Qais Sibsi. So Qais Said.
It's a Freudian slip.
Yeah, I can tell. So Qais Said, who in 2020, and I hear Kinza just, I tried to summarize the idea, which is definitely there. So I will try to quote him, and I quote, saying the debate around inheritance is false and misguided. We must first establish socioeconomic equality between women and men before talking about inheritance. And here I raise the question, if we're talking about establishing socioeconomic equality between men and women, how can we do that while women do already suffer from male counterparts, domestic violence and marital rape and even, let's say, deprivation from the mere, the normal, let's say, the basic needs of, daily life. So I do actually believe that the inheritance issue is not only religious. I do believe it's about, a male dominance rather than a religious, from religious, let's say, spectrum or aspect. So.
Thank you, Fadwa. And you touch on the economic aspect, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that in detail. But Fadwa Al-Ouni, I want to turn to you for kind of a perspective on the sense of loss that we have sort of all felt and witnessed in the presence of women in politics and women's representation in politics. This was I think it's really interesting to look at the performance of women in the 2014 election, when I think a third of MPs elected were women, by contrast to this election, where I think women represented only 10% of candidates that were running. The result of the new laws and all of the restrictions that were put on just the entire way in which the election law was shaped. So talk a little bit about the implications of that absence. Explain a little bit more what these requirements in the election law have meant for women, for the women's ability to run, for women's ability to actually present themselves as candidates, to put together a campaign, and this absence that we are going to expect, this absence of women in this current parliament or in this new parliament. What are the implications of that? If you can talk us a little bit through that.
Thank you. First of all, I wanted to give a quick background on the pre-existing legal framework, especially during the previous elections. So the electoral law, as it is today, has went through several rounds of amendments. And I believe the most remarkable amendment in a positive sense was the one in 2017, which laid the groundwork for the municipal elections, which were held in 2019. And I say remarkable because that amendment came with relatively revolutionary means for representation, not only for women, but also for youth and people with disabilities. Since the municipal elections had better conditions, such as horizontal parity. So parity wasn't necessarily only inside the list, but also horizontally for parties and coalitions running in several electoral districts or constituencies. Therefore, if a certain party had several lists in several districts, they needed to have parity between the heads of lists. This has created a positive impact on the number of women who were heads of candidate lists, but also increased the participation and the presence of women as mayors. Since to be elected as mayor, you need to be not only you need to be elected in the municipal council, but you needed to be the head of your list. So it also created better access for youth and people with disabilities with financial incentives, such as the public financing that required the candidate lists to have a candidate with disability among the first 10 candidates, and also more strict criteria when it comes to the participation of youth, especially that the number of required candidates for the municipal elections were much larger than the number of candidates in the lists for the parliamentary elections. And this has led the civil society to actually, especially those who worked on monitoring elections, to start advocacy campaigns with the former law and to extend these positive conditions to the legislative elections and say, this worked in the municipal elections, why not extend these conditions to the legislative elections and promote better accessibility to women, to youth, to people with disabilities. But then as the advocacy was happening, July 25 happened and it solved everything. And this has led to several other amendments subsequently of the electoral law by decrees, and they certainly changed the electoral system and completely reshaping it. And before I go into the post-2021 era, I wanted to also draw the attention that although there were these amendments that were positive towards more representativity, there were also other hindrances that weren't specifically targeting women and youth, but they were, in a way, let's say, collateral damage, even though they weren't the main targets, namely the restriction of public funding. So for those who didn't know, public funding in 2011, it was given upfront to the candidates. And then when people weren't able to return the money, it was changed to a 50-50, 50% before and 50% after. And then by 2019, candidates needed to fund themselves, and then they would get reimbursed by the state. So this has significantly impacted women candidates in 2019, since with the absence of personal means in the first hand, it is only logical that that women, youth, and people with disabilities were the first to be impacted by such restrictions. And with the current elections, with the switch of the system and the elimination of the public financing altogether, it had a major impact on the participation of youth and women, as most of them did not have the means to create their own campaigns, and knowing very well that they will not even be able to be reimbursed. So this was a major block.
Sorry, I just want you to clarify a little bit the question of public financing. Was it withdrawn because the state simply doesn't have money to support these campaigns, or was it withdrawn out of some kind of desire to, I don't know, encourage transparency, and sort of what was the rationale behind that?
I think it was a mix of the two, because for the finance monitoring, it was mainly the task of the central bank and the Ministry of Finance, the first hand, to monitor the flow of money and to see if candidates were receiving foreign funding, which is prohibited by the electoral law. But on the later stage, when it comes to the actual monitoring and review of the finances, the campaign finances, it was up to the Court of Accounts or the Court of Auditors, which is a very major task. And after every elections, they would have a set of recommendations asking for a reform of the system. They do not have the financial means, they do not have the human resources to monitor the bulk of records that they need to go through with a very lengthy procedure, since there isn't a specific procedure for electoral related matters. So there are candidates in 2019 who weren't reimbursed until this day, due to the lengthy procedure. So if we combine the Court of Auditors complaints about the procedure, the campaign finance monitoring procedure, with the scarcity of state funds, public funds, the decision was apparently made to eliminate public financing altogether, and this definitely put a major wrench in the gears of the access and accessibility of women and youth and people with disabilities.
I want you to finish the point that you were trying to make. I'm sorry I interrupted you. You were talking about how this sort of was created a kind of a collateral damage and really hampered the way in which women are present now in this election. Do we have a sense of what the results are in terms of women's presence? Do we know? How do you, where do you see this going, basically? Are we going to have a parliament that has very few women?
So far, the results are, to me personally, slightly better than I anticipated. A lot of women candidates actually came first in the ranking of candidates. There are a few constituencies, I do not recall the exact number, but the two runner-ups, the two candidates running for a second round are actually both women, which guarantees that constituency will have a woman MP. But overall, the number is definitely low, and it definitely had to do with the reshaping of the system. Single seat based districts is reliant heavily on the candidate's reputation, on the candidate's means, on the candidate's how many contacts they have, how much of a good reputation they have among their constituency, and also the required endorsements, which were a hindrance for women in less urban areas, where it would be difficult for women to go door to door and request people to provide them with endorsements. So I cannot find the word, the invisible barrier in spaces between the male space and the female space was the invisible player in the candidacy process, as it was one of the major blocks hindering women in less urban areas from being able to access the candidacy phase and to be able to compete in a fair election. Overall, as I said, the participation rate and the presence of women in the elected parliament, so far it looks better than I personally anticipated, but it would still be less than anyone would have hoped to have
Previous
parliament,
yeah.
Especially compared to previous parliaments.
And it's a particularly sort of poignant, I guess, contradiction maybe, or dichotomy when you look at the fact that Tunisia now has its first female prime minister, and I think the first in the Arab region in general. So I'm wondering if there's been, what is the sense sort of among Tunisians when they look at this contradictory picture? How do women reflect on this? Any of you, Fadwa, I'll come to you first, but any of you that's interested in weighing in on this, I'd be curious to hear.
For me personally, it was nice to have, and it is nice to have a woman as head of government, but the question I would ask is, at what cost? Because if you ask me or Fadwa or Kenza or any other Tunisian woman, they would tell you that they would love to have a woman in leadership position, in any leadership position, to be able to fill that spot and to actually exercise her prerogatives fully and to be able to be a shining example for young women everywhere, that if you work hard enough, if you put the effort, you are able to reach these leadership positions and to make actual change. And with the current image that we have been seeing so far, it does not look like much is happening, especially with the expectations that you would anticipate from a woman in such a big position. It comes with its own expectations, and I'm not sure where I would go from this. I think we all got the point of what I'm trying to say.
You make an excellent point of this sort of being a bit of a hollow victory. It's a victory in a sense, but there's very little sort of satisfaction to it, and I think that's certainly a feeling that I think most of us can sympathize with. Fadwa, I want to talk a little bit more. I want to make sort of a shift here of gears and talk a little bit more about the economy. We've mentioned a little bit the economy as kind of, when we were talking about the inheritance law and the extent to which that sort of impacts women's economic well-being and women's economic future. But I also want you to reflect a little bit more broadly on where Tunisian women stand right now in terms of sort of the economic situation. As I mentioned at the start of the conversation, of course, there's been the pandemic that's really disproportionately affected women's economic situation, women's economic well-being. Of course, for Tunisia, this comes on kind of on the heels of what has already been a growing economic crisis, where you have high unemployment, particularly among women, low GDP growth. So tell us a little bit more about how this plays out specifically for women, many of whom are highly educated. I think women still represent, in Tunisia as in other places, represent a higher percentage of university graduates, but they also still face significantly higher unemployment rates.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Intisar, but I don't know if I may respond first to you.
Please do. Yeah.
I cannot really help it because I just, heard what
Yes.
said and yourself saying a hollow victory. And this actually responds back to one of our participants, Mr. Ayman Abdurrahman and Mrs. I'm not sure if Miss or Mr. So it's Mahnes Harrison, asking about how elected women have a real power to govern and what has been done by the female prime minister in MENA region. If you allow me, and this is a very personal point of view and from my personal perspective, I've never seen, the election or the nomination of Prime Minister Najla Boudan as a victory to Tunisia, being a female. And I'm here, going against the grains. But I would say by making this flattering and thinking that being a female, having or holding such a position is already something special for us, I would say that we're already imposing this idea of differentiating between men and women. Why don't we actually think about in a flattery way when a man holds such a position? So I don't really agree on that point. And I'm not going to delve into, what has been done by the Prime Minister, maybe in the Q&A session that could be, developed better, in a better way. But I would say nothing, probably, if not that much, has been done so far. Unfortunately, I was expecting, to be honest, when I had, the name, in front of my eyes, I was thinking about Angela Merkel, for instance, and her contribution to her people. Same applies to ages ago, Margaret Thatcher. So I was expecting something like that. Unfortunately, I just, witnessed something that could be considered as nothing when compared to if we have a comparative study between countries. Now getting back to your question on the economic and social impact that women have suffered, once again, if we say suffered, we're already, categorized or labeled women into a certain, let's say, from a certain paradigm or a certain corner, saying that we already suffer. I do believe that we did, but moving from a health, that's a pandemic, to a global economic crisis, no wonder that every single country, men and women, have suffered alike. Probably proportionally, that has been quite differences between men and women. And we cannot blame only governments or states. We can blame as well cultures and societies and societal norms and customs and traditions, because we have automatically, during the pandemic and after the pandemic, we automatically, whenever we think about who is, let's say, the bearer and the provider of the house, or for the household, we always think about men instead of women. And if I give you an anecdote or an example, if we say, oh, my man is staying home, taking care of the kids, and I'm, performing work, that would be, considered as an effeminate side of a man, not being, a child, a real man, taking care of the household. So that's just, an example to show you that society helped in a way or another, let's say, positioning women in a certain corner, not only due to pandemic, but every single time we have a kind of this crisis. Another thing that I would like to tackle is that Tunisian economic businesses, they are already, or they are in particular based on what we call it small and medium-sized enterprises. So that's why probably we suffered most when it comes to right after the pandemic. And if we want to think about women, I'd rather start by pointing out at rural women, probably because this is where I find it. I find the hindrances and the challenges, because if you are in the city, it's way better rather than being in rural areas. So, for example, United Nations Women Report in 2020, April 2020, they have actually dedicated a study, or they have worked on a study on rural women, and they have came up with a certain percentage, and I would love to share with you the percentages presented by United Nations Women Report on 2020, that rural women account for 4% of land owners, and 58% of agricultural workforce, and 80% of forestry workforce, and 15% of country's workforce. When we think about that, while continuing to work during the pandemic, allowing Tunisians for food and have access to food security, and when we try to think about these percentages and we compare them to the way we treat women and to the way women suffer from discriminatory working conditions compared to other male counterparts, and the same risks during transportation, I wonder if, as a woman, I'm already and always treated as a second citizen when I'm compared to a male counterpart, but still I'm contributing to my society and to my people as a labor, as part of the workforce and labor force. Same applies to during the pandemic, for instance, the unequal sharing of family burden. Remember that we're talking about the social and the economic impact of the pandemic, but at the same time, after the pandemic, let's give some fairness to men. There was a study that has been done as well about United Nations women that said that 80% of women they shared thoughts about men who have been trying to help with the household, with, let's say, with the house chores, etc. However, if we want to tackle another point, we can talk about the domestic violence against women that has been increasing during the pandemic and after the pandemic. So when we talk about this contribution to both social and economic spheres, we certainly see a kind of disproportions when it comes to men and women. Another thing that I can talk about, that no matter where we are, the crisis of the pandemic is having a dramatic impact on the global workforce. So let's not try to overgeneralize it, thinking about, or trying to victimize women. I always take a stand, from women saying that as a feminist and a female advocate, I don't want to be victimized and look, upon as someone who is always in need or who is always, trying to get help. But we need to acknowledge the fact that men and women, the inequality between them has been worsened due to pandemic and after the pandemic. And here I would say that has been something that is entitled the feminization of poverty. We've tried actually during the pandemic and after the pandemic to think that women in agricultural or non-agricultural workers, as well as unemployed women, they suffered the most from the negative impacts of the pandemic crisis. Another, I don't know if I still have some time, just to
go ahead.
Yeah, just to call upon again the societal negative impact of during the pandemic that has been an increase actually in calls for help and requests for emergency shelter between the 23rd of March and the 31st of May by 9,800 calls that has been recorded by the MFFES. So we're saying this, that women, they literally suffered most. But we always need to give, a credit to men who have been trying to help and, to stand for them. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Fadwa. I want to, for the next few minutes that we have left, I want to try to kind of look a little bit at the solutions aspect of this conversation. And here I want to maybe come to you, Kenza, to have you talk a little bit about grassroots responses. Where do you see some of the dynamism in that area? And I also want to wrap in some of the questions that have come in along the same lines. There's a question here from Anne Moishan. What can Tunisian women do as an organized group to kind of help? And what role is there, do you think, for international organizations, and how can they help in this effort? There's also another question from Timothy Stephen talking about women's access to Wi-Fi. Does anyone have any ideas on how to help girls get Wi-Fi so they can continue their education? Just ways to sort of try to think a little bit more hopefully about the future.
Okay. Quite a lot to unpack here. So I'm just going to come back on a few points, and then please remind me if there's any that I'm missing out on. Just one small thing to add in terms of Najla Bouden's election. Yeah, I agree completely with Fadwa. I think 1 year on, we can't really say that anything has been achieved to help women. Actually, the political instability, I'm not saying that she's the leader of it, but to which she's also a tacit member of by affiliation, actually has prevented us from moving on and debating potentially the signature of the Istanbul Convention. So there's a lot that we're missing out on and not doing during this small crisis, while at the same time, Najla Bouden's election has given some sort of confusion or doubt on the international scene and even domestically as to Kais Said's position on women's rights. And I think we need to go far, far beyond the election of a woman. What we want is to have feminist politics implemented, and it's not really a matter of having a woman there. And actually, like anecdotally, a lot of feminists on the ground, so that also touches on, I think, one of the questions on what's happening on the ground is that what we have seen is that there's been a very strong development of political analysts and critics, and I think also Fadwa can say more to that, but whether it's on Aswat Nise or their followers, we see that there's much, I think, higher political awareness. There's the gender meter that has been launched a few years ago by Aswat Nise, and I think there's a wider discussion of what is going on in terms of gender measures and how they impact women. So Najla Bouden's election has in some way, I think, almost harmed in some way, because it has given a doubt of legitimacy in terms of Kais Said's position with regards to women's rights. And I think it's a little bit farcical, to be frank. And then to go back, I just want to really insist on the point that was made on societies and cultures. And I think it's, again, just as for the equality in inheritance law, very often it's almost a safe analysis to have this, because then it's something that women are also responsible of and that we all partake in, but it is first of all also embedded within the state. I think the state's policies inform perpetually how society is constructed, and also that this is a culture that, again, is global, and we all know this, of course. But I think legislations, whether it's equality inheritance or the fact that in the personal status code, men are still considered officially to be the heads of household. So no matter the 12 hours a day that women are doing at work, and this is a figure that we derive from Oxfam's work in partnership with the ATFD, I believe, and that they conducted last year, which should have really been the state's responsibility to conduct these surveys. I think the last one was a decade ago, and they found out that about 12 hours a day is spent by women on domestic chores. And yes, men have, I've read this great study by UN Women also, again, not by a state agency, that is that found that men did uptake a little bit more of domestic chores, but that's also, I think we need to nuance that the fact that there was constrained physical capacities also. So what else did they have to do? Because also some of the tasks that they did take, if we look at the breakdown, is not that they were suddenly cooking meals for everyone. The task that they did the most was to play with a child while doing activities outdoors, or to discuss about life topics with children, versus changing les couches, I don't know how to say
diaper, changing diapers. It's all about the where the initial bar is, right?
Exactly. So anyhow, but okay. Yeah, these are the main points that I wanted to look at. Yes, also an important element is something that the Arab Barometer identified recently, is that there has been a greater inclination of male public also in Tunisia, and of the general public as well, with regards to women's position in the political sphere and their ability to take political decisions and to be part of political leaders. So while there has been an increase in positive perceptions with regards to women's ability to lead politically, this does not apply to the private sphere. So we really see this discrepancy where, okay, women are just as able than men to do it, or perhaps the question is even women are just as unable or unqualified to do it as men. And I think there is a wide political disenchantment also within population. So I don't think the fact that they're seeing women just as good means necessarily that there's a pro-feminist take on this. But they still consider that men should be taking every decision within the household. So I think it's really capital to always go back to the everyday lives that make up our civilization. Okay, and then to go back to what's being done and what could be done on a grassroots level, I think it's a very important question. I mean, somehow when I think grassroots, I think decentralization, and I think regions and outside of Tunis. And as part of my research for Human Rights Watch, we went to Gibs, went to El Kif, and we see that we are living in two parallel timeframes. Some, women who refuse to go shopping, like there's on their own, and who need to be constantly accompanied and even policed by their brothers, especially in the south of the country. What was reported is that it's not only the physical violence of their fathers or their husbands that they dread, but especially of their brothers. There is such a strong level of control, and I think we need to start talking about it and talking about it more within the family sphere. And I understand there's a certain reluctance by feminists to go back to the family structure because we don't want to infantilize women, and I appreciate this, but the reality is that brothers especially still hold so much control on women, because it is their way of exercising, again, masculinity as opposed to their father, and kind of taking over in a worse way. So this really came out a lot. And I think so on the level of the regions, and again, every region has its own particularity, but especially the South, that has been completely abandoned since, this dates back to colonization, and there have been very few administrations and infrastructures that are there. It is also the part of the country where there is the most Black populations, and I think we still have a lot of work to do in terms of intersectionality here, and looking at how much harder it is also perhaps for a Black woman to not only have a Black Tunisian woman to have greater rights. And of course, this is all on a scale, no? So the same goes for rural Tunisian women who face their challenges, but I just think that it is perhaps exacerbating in terms of what they feel they can voice in front of a policeman in Tunisia still. So there's so much to do here in terms of awareness raising, again, because women are not aware of their rights. So I think this is one big one to start, and two, keeping up the discussion on on equality and inheritance. And exactly, Fadwa, thank you for reminding like the complete absurdity of the term of wanting to work on social economic justice and not working on equality and inheritance. Voila. And then in terms of Wi-Fi for education, I don't know, and I'm no expert definitely on this, and also I don't know if the answer really lies there, because women are still present in schools at a very strong percentage, as opposed in contrast to men, but they don't find themselves being remunerated in the same capacities or even the job opportunities that Tunisia has to offer. The most qualified women leave this country, and we can't blame them. So it's much broader still.
Yeah, absolutely. We are a little bit running over time, but Fadwa Al-Ouni, I want to give you the last word, and I particularly, you've weighed in on the question of political representation. There's a really good question here that I see from Saeed Sadiq. Politicians in the Middle East often adopt women's issue to portray image of modernity and smokescreen their authoritarian rule. And here I'm, of course, Tunisia, I'm thinking about Saudi Arabia, I'm thinking about a number of other examples that we have seen. Does that apply to Tunisian leaders from Bourguiba to Qais Said? And how can, and I think this is maybe really the big question, how can feminists prevent authoritarian leaders from exploiting their cause for their own vested interests rather than the real interests of women? So I'll give you the last word on this, Fadwa.
First of all, I agree. It has been the magic wand that gives politicians the green light, so to speak, as to win the badge for promoter of women's rights. And that would be the smoke screen behind which other things, less pleasant things would happen, and less pleasant agendas would happen. And this is part of the main issue that Tunisians have struggled with in the post-revolution era, is moving the conversation from the economic side to the ideology side, and creating this false narrative of us versus them, and putting rights and freedoms and women's rights in the forefront, and neglecting all else. And I'm not saying it's less important, but that should not be the sole criteria on which we should pick our political leaders, and we should give our endorsements. And that has given them the idea that it is the Trojan horse behind which they can sneak in all kinds of economic policies that people do not necessarily agree with, but under the pretense that XYZ is a champion of women's rights, and then they go around and do something completely different after being elected, and later people will forget about it. And so I think it is, and it has been, one of the major issues that we've struggled with. And it sounds easy to say, but it's definitely pretty difficult, and it takes a long time and a lot of effort to do. But we need to have more female leaders in the political sphere. It sounds easy to say, again, but it takes a lot of work. And that is also the issue of political parties, which sadly are not doing their job as incubators of female leaders. They only remember them when it comes to elections. And they're not doing their actual job in creating women leaders who are able to champion for their own rights, and to have their own word on the floor, and to speak for their own rights and freedoms, and to create actual change and better access for women on all the aspects, namely the economic aspect. I also wanted to just one of the questions asking about whether these elected women would have real power to govern. Technically, from a legal standpoint, none of the future MPs will have any real power to govern per the new constitution's description of the parliament's duties. So just, I'm gonna leave it there. As far as the next steps, we are still in the electoral period, in the electoral process. We are expecting the second round of legislative elections on January 29th. But we should not be focused only on this. This year, the last election was 5 years ago in 2018. There's also the National Council for Regions and Districts, which is previewed by the new constitution, but we still have no idea the exact prerogatives. It is composed of representatives from the regional councils, which are yet to be elected. So we should also expect regional elections. And then we should also expect presidential elections in 2024, as that is the end of the current mandate that started in 2019. And one of the major steps that we should be following through is the implementation of the Constitutional Court, which is yet to be done. And although the current constitution previews the exact positions of who should be implemented, they cannot be appointed until there is an actual law that previews the functioning of the court and the exact implementation and the exact appointment procedure. Therefore, that is one of the major keys in the next phase, since Constitutional Court is the main and will be the main line of defense against any possible infringement on women's rights in the coming years.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Fadwa Al-Ouni, Fadwa Bouguerra, and Kenza Ben Azzouz. There's so much more that we could have talked about, and we hopefully can pick up in future conversations. But I wanted to thank you both for your thoughtful answers, your thoughtful comments. And I also want to thank our audience for joining us, and our MEI events team for helping us put this conversation together.